You
Her
are not
mother-in-law
part of our
shouted,
family.
"You are not
Even a
part of our
beggar wouldn't
family.
marry you."
Even a beggar wouldn't marry you."
Meet my son's new wife.
Then she welcomed her pregnant friend and said, "Meet my son's new wife." She simply smiled, turned around, and left the room. At 6 a.m. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories, your own family story channel. May the Almighty bless every woman with endless strength, wisdom, and a heart that radiates love to everyone around her. May she rise above every challenge with grace, carry the weight of the world with dignity, and light up every home she enters. Women are the true pillars of life, the silent warriors, and the guiding stars who make this world meaningful and beautiful. May your health be perfect, your mind peaceful, your hearts filled with joy, and your families safe and united. May every step you take be protected, every tear wiped away, and every dream fulfilled with divine guidance. Your courage, patience, and love deserve the highest honor in this world. If your heart is true, like the video. If your love is real, write, "I am with Mr. Peter. Let's start with love." Jean Barry stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse office, watching the city breathe beneath her in the darkness. The wineglass in her hand had gone warm, untouched, while her mind replayed the memory that refused to fade. Rain, so much rain that night, turning the streets into rivers, washing away everything except the sound of a woman sobbing outside the shelter. She could still see Mona Parker curled against the brick wall, soaked through, belly swollen with pregnancy, bruises on her arms in the shape of fingers. The baby's father had vanished, Mona had whispered through chattering teeth, left her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a baby coming in the winter. Jean had crouched down in her expensive coat, ruining the silk lining in the puddles, and said the words that would destroy her life years later. "Come with me. I'll help you." Now, sitting in the silence of her empire, Jean opened her desk drawer and pulled out the small wooden box she'd been avoiding for days. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a hospital bracelet. So tiny. Pink plastic with smudged ink that read "Baby Girl Parker" and a date from over 2 years ago. Jean had been in that delivery room, holding Mona's hand while she screamed, cutting the umbilical cord when the doctor offered, crying harder than Mona when that perfect little girl took her first breath. Lily. They'd named her Lily because Jean said it meant rebirth, new beginnings, pure love. Jean traced the bracelet with one finger, remembering how Lily had wrapped her entire hand around Jean's pinky in those first moments. How Mona had whispered, "Thank you for saving us. You're my angel." The photograph beneath the bracelet showed Jean holding newborn Lily, both of them in the hospital, Jean's face glowing with a joy she'd never felt before. After the miscarriage that left her unable to have children, Lily had been a gift, a chance to love a child, even if that child wasn't hers by blood. She'd given Mona the guest house behind the main property, paid for everything, diapers, formula, clothes, doctor visits, everything. Frank had been uncertain at first. "Jean, we don't know this woman," he'd said that first night, watching Mona settle into the guest house with her few belongings. "What if she's trouble?" Jean had kissed his cheek, loving him for his caution, foolish enough to ignore it. "She needs help. We have more than enough. It's the right thing to do." Frank had trusted her judgment. Back then, he still trusted her about most things. The memory shifted, and Jean's chest tightened with the weight of what came after. Frank's architecture firm had been drowning in debt. She remembered him pacing their bedroom, hands in his hair, voice breaking as he told her they might lose everything. "I've worked so hard, Jean, 10 years building this firm, and one bad project could destroy it all." She'd held him that night, stroking his hair, promising him it would be okay. What she didn't tell him was that by morning she'd already made the calls. Her college roommate owned a development company across 3 states. One conversation, one favor called in, and suddenly Frank's firm was being considered for the Riverside Development Project. The contract had been massive, career-defining. Frank had celebrated for weeks, taking his business partners out for drinks, convinced his presentation had won them over, that his talent had finally been recognized. Jean had eaten dinner alone most of those nights, smiling at her phone when he texted her updates about his success, typing back the same response every time. "So proud of you." The truth sat in her office files, locked away where Frank would never think to look. She'd done more than get him the contract. When his firm couldn't make payroll, she'd quietly bought their debt through a shell company, then forgave it. When clients were ready to walk, she'd convinced them to stay. When Frank needed investors, she'd become one anonymously, funneling money through trusted friends who signed the papers with their own names. Every success he'd celebrated, every victory he'd claimed, every moment he'd felt powerful and accomplished, she'd built it all in the shadows, carefully, lovingly, making sure he never knew, because Frank needed to believe in himself. He needed to feel like a man who'd earned his empire through skill and determination, and Jean had loved him enough to give him that gift, even if it meant making herself invisible. But Mona had seen everything. Living in the guest house, watching John work late into the night, seeing the phone calls and the careful orchestration of Frank's career. Mona had been so grateful in the beginning, always thanking John, calling her my angel, bringing Lily over to play in the main house. Jean closed her eyes, remembering the first time she'd felt the shift. Coming home early from a meeting, finding Mona in the kitchen with Frank, laughing at something he'd said. Nothing wrong with that, nothing suspicious, except Mona's hand had been on Frank's arm and she'd been wearing makeup, perfume, a fitted dress, instead of her usual comfortable clothes. Jean had pushed the worry away. Mona owed her everything. Frank loved her. She was being paranoid. The second time, she'd walked in on them watching a movie together, Lily asleep on Frank's lap. Again, nothing technically wrong, but the way they'd jumped apart, the guilty flush on Mona's face, the way Frank had quickly handed Lily back to her mother. "John, you're home early," Frank had said, and there was something in his voice she'd never heard before. Distance, guilt, something. "I live here," Jean had replied, keeping her voice light, ignoring the ice forming in her stomach. The third time she hadn't walked in on anything. She'd simply noticed that Frank started working late more often, that he stopped asking about her day, that when she touched him, he seemed distracted, somewhere else in his mind. And Mona, sweet, grateful Mona, had started wearing Jean's perfume. Small things at first, then bigger ones, using the same phrases Jean used, styling her hair the same way, almost like she was practicing, preparing, auditioning for a role, the role of Frank's wife. Jean had still refused to believe it, even when Frank's mother, Diane, started calling more often, visiting more frequently, always making excuses to see Mona and Lily. Even when Diane would make her cutting comments about Jean being too focused on business and not maternal enough, then turn to Mona and coo over Lily like she was the most precious thing in the world. Diane had never cooed over Jean, not once in 8 years of marriage. The photograph beneath Lily's hospital bracelet was a handwritten note, the ink slightly smudged from Jean's tears the night she'd finally let herself cry. Mona's handwriting from those early days when gratitude was still real. "Thank you for saving us. I'll never forget your kindness. You gave me and my baby a home when we had nothing. I'll spend my life trying to repay you. You're the best person I've ever known." Jean's laugh came out bitter and sharp in the empty office. She folded the note carefully, placed it back in the box with the bracelet and the photograph, and closed the drawer. "Neither will I, Mona," she whispered to the darkness. "Neither will I." Her phone buzzed on the desk, a message from Rita Cross, her attorney and oldest friend. "Everything ready. Just say when." Jean looked out at the city again, at the empire she'd built, while Frank thought he was building his own. At the buildings with her name on them, the foundations she'd created, the lives she'd changed, all of it invisible to the man she'd loved, because he'd been too busy seeing himself to ever really see her. She picked up her phone and typed one word. Now. Another message came through, this one from Eddie Flynn, a photograph of him at the children's hospital, surrounded by kids in wheelchairs, all of them laughing at something he'd said. The caption read, "These kids asked about you. Said their favorite volunteer hasn't visited in weeks. Everything okay?" Jean stared at the photo. Eddie had kind eyes, the kind of eyes that actually saw people, that noticed when someone was hurting, that cared without expecting anything in return. They'd met at a fundraiser months ago, and he'd been the first person in years to ask Jeanne about herself, instead of what she could do for them. "You look tired," he'd said, and the simple observation had almost broken her, because Frank hadn't noticed she was tired, hadn't noticed much about her at all anymore. She didn't respond to Eddie's message. Not yet. First, there was something she needed to do. Jeanne stood, smoothed her dress, and walked to the window one last time. Somewhere across the city, Frank was probably in bed with Mona in the house Jeanne had bought, sleeping peacefully, believing he'd earned everything he had. Tomorrow morning, the sun would rise on a very different world. Tomorrow morning, the invisible queen would finally let them see her crown, and it would be too late for any of them to look away. Chapter 2. The woman no one saw. The memory came to Jeanne in fragments. Like shattered glass, she was forced to piece together over and over again. Diane Lawton's birthday party, the one Jeanne had organized for months, calling caterers and florists, booking the vineyard estate, arranging transportation for family members flying in from across the country. The one Diane had complained about constantly, saying Jean was trying too hard and making it about herself. Jean had bitten her tongue and kept planning, because that's what good daughters-in-law did. That's what invisible women did. The party had been beautiful. Diane's friends had gushed about the decorations, the food, the thoughtfulness of every detail. And when it came time to open gifts, Jeanne had presented hers with trembling hands and a hopeful heart. A spa retreat, not just any spa, but the exclusive mountain resort Diane had mentioned wanting to visit for years. Diane had opened the envelope, read the card, and her face had done something Jean would never forget. It had gone flat, cold. Then she'd held up the gift certificate and announced to the entire room in that carrying voice of hers, "How thoughtful. Though I prefer gifts from the heart, not the wallet. My son married beneath him, but she tries." The room had gone silent. Every eye had turned to Jeanne. She'd felt her face burning, her throat closing, but she'd smiled, gracious, understanding, exactly what was expected. "I'm glad you like it, Diane," she'd said, and her voice hadn't even shaken. Frank had found her later in the bathroom, fixing her makeup where the tears had tried to escape. "Mum's just old-fashioned," he'd said, not quite meeting her eyes in the mirror. "Don't take it personally. Don't take it personally. As if there was any other way to take having your worth publicly dismissed by your husband's mother, while your husband stood by and said nothing." Jean had gone back to the party, smiled, made small talk, played the role of the gracious hostess for the woman who'd just humiliated her. And when they got home that night, Frank had fallen asleep immediately, snoring softly, while Jean lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering when exactly she'd become someone whose feelings didn't matter. The memory dissolved, replaced by another. Frank's face, pale and sweating, as he told her about the Morrison Hotel project, how his firm had submitted their best work, how they'd been so close to winning the contract only to be undercut by a competitor's lower bid. "We needed this, Jean," he'd said, and she'd heard the devastation in his voice. "This was supposed to be our breakthrough project. Without it, I don't know how we're going to survive the next quarter." She'd held him on the couch, running her fingers through his hair, making soothing sounds while her mind was already working. By the time Frank had cried himself to sleep on her shoulder, she'd already decided what to do. The next morning, she'd been in her office before dawn, one phone call to an old friend who sat on the Morrison board, a conversation about vision and reliability and the importance of working with firms that understood the long game rather than just offering the cheapest immediate option. By noon, Frank's firm had won the contract. Frank had called her screaming with joy, actually screaming. "Jean, we got it! We got the Morrison! I don't know how, but we did it. I'm taking the partners out to celebrate tonight." "That's wonderful, honey," she'd said, and she'd meant it. His happiness was worth the favors she'd have to repay, the careful manipulation she'd had to employ. "I'm so proud of you." "Thanks, babe. Don't wait up, okay? This is a big night for us." Us. His firm, his partners. Not her. Never her. Jean had eaten takeout alone that night, scrolling through photos on her phone of Frank and his partners at some expensive steakhouse, all of them grinning like they'd conquered the world through sheer talent and determination. The invisible hand that had actually won them the contract sat at home in pajamas, eating cold noodles, liking his photos and typing, "You deserve this," in the comments. Months later, at a hospital fundraiser, Jean had met Eddie Flynn for the first time. She'd been standing by the bar, exhausted from another 18-hour workday, trying to remember why she'd agreed to attend. Frank was supposed to be her date, but he'd cancelled last minute. Another work emergency, another evening alone in a crowd of people. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," a voice had said, and she'd turned to find a man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "I'm Eddie, and before you ask, yes, I'm supposed to be working the room and asking rich people for money, but honestly, I'm terrible at it." Jean had laughed. Actually laughed. When was the last time she'd done that? "Jean," she'd said, shaking his hand, "and I'll save you the trouble. How much do you need?" Eddie had blinked. "I didn't mean it like that." "I know. That's why I'm asking. What do you do?" He'd told her about his free clinics in underserved neighborhoods, about kids who couldn't afford basic medical care, about families choosing between medicine and food, about how broken the system was for people without money or connections. He'd talked with passion and frustration and a bone-deep caring that made Jean's chest ache. "You really love them," she'd said, "the people you help." "They're not charity cases," Eddie had replied, and there was something fierce in his voice. "They're human beings who deserve dignity and care. I just try to give them what they should already have." They'd talked for hours, about everything and nothing, about the city and its problems, about hope and cynicism, about what it meant to make a difference. And for the first time in longer than Jean could remember, someone had asked her opinion and actually listened to her answer, actually cared what she thought. "You have a light in you," Eddie had said as the evening wound down. "It's rare. I hope the people in your life appreciate it." Jean had smiled, but it hadn't reached her eyes. "My husband says I'm too serious, too focused on work." Eddie's expression had shifted, softened, saddened. "Then he's not paying attention." She'd gone home that night to find Frank already asleep, and she'd stood in the doorway of their bedroom for a long time, watching him, wondering when they'd stopped being a team. When had she become just the woman who lived in his house and fixed his problems and asked for nothing in return? The shift with Mona had started so subtly that Jean had almost missed it, almost. But once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. Mona had started wearing makeup when she came to the main house, just a little at first. Some mascara, lip gloss, then more. Foundation, eyeshadow, hair styled instead of pulled back in a ponytail. Perfume that Jean recognized because it was the same one she wore. "You look nice," Jean had said one morning when Mona had come over to borrow sugar. "Oh, this?" Mona had touched her hair self-consciously. "I just thought I should make more of an effort, you know." You always look so put together. It had seemed like a compliment, maybe even admiration. Jean had helped her pick out some new clothes on their next shopping trip, pleased to see Mona gaining confidence, coming out of her shell. But then there was the afternoon Jean had come home early and found Mona in the kitchen with Frank, just talking, nothing inappropriate, except Mona's hand had been on Frank's arm, and she'd been laughing at something he'd said in that high, musical way that seemed calculated to charm. And when they'd noticed Jean in the doorway, they'd jumped apart like teenagers caught doing something wrong. "Jean," Frank had said, and there was guilt in his voice. Guilt. "You're home early." "I live here," Jean had replied, keeping her tone light even as her stomach twisted. "Don't let me interrupt." "We were just talking," Mona had said quickly, too quickly. "About Lily. She's been having nightmares." Lily had been napping peacefully in Mona's arms, her little face serene and unmarked by any bad dreams. Jean had let it go. What else could she do? Accuse them of something based on a feeling? A tone? The way they'd looked at each other for half a second too long? But she'd started noticing other things. How Frank found excuses to walk over to the guest house. How Mona started asking Jean about Frank's favorite foods, his favorite movies, his childhood memories. How Lily had started calling Frank by his first name, then shortened it to something that sounded almost affectionate. How Diane had started visiting more often, always with excuses to see Mona and Lily. How she'd coo over the child, calling her beautiful and smart and perfect, while Jean stood nearby, invisible as always. "You're so good with her," Diane would tell Mona, her voice warm in a way it never was with Jean. "Such a natural mother. Not everyone has that gift." The implication was clear. Jean, who couldn't have children, who'd suffered through a miscarriage that had nearly destroyed her, who'd loved Lily like her own from the moment she was born, didn't have that gift. Wasn't maternal, wasn't woman enough. Jean had gone home after one of those visits and found Frank's old love letters in a box in their closet. Letters he'd written her when they were first dating, full of promises and poetry and passion. She'd sat on the floor reading them, tears streaming down her face, wondering when he'd stopped writing her letters, when he'd stopped seeing her at all. "You're the strongest person I know," one letter had read. "You make me want to be better. I can't imagine my life without you." Jean had pressed the letter to her chest and cried until she couldn't breathe. Because somewhere along the way, the man who'd written those words had disappeared, and in his place was someone who came home late, who forgot their anniversary, who looked past her like she was furniture. She'd put the letters back in the box and hidden them in the back of the closet, where they couldn't hurt her anymore. The final warning had come at a charity gala John had organized. Months of work, raising money for children's hospitals, bringing together donors and foundations and corporate sponsors. She'd been on stage accepting thanks from the hospital director, talking about the importance of giving children access to quality health care, when she'd spotted Eddie in the crowd. He'd smiled at her. Not the polite smile you give acquaintances, but something genuine and warm and proud, like he saw her, really saw her. Not what she could do or what she could provide, but her. After the speeches, he'd found her at the refreshment table. "You were amazing up there. How much did you raise?" Jean had told him, and his eyes had widened. "That's incredible. Do you know how many lives you just changed?" "It's just money," she'd said, uncomfortable with the praise. "Anyone with a checkbook could have done it." "No," Eddie had said firmly. "Anyone with a checkbook can write a check. You built something. You brought people together. You made them care. That's not money, Jean. That's magic." She'd felt tears prick her eyes and had looked away quickly, not wanting him to see how much his words affected her. How starved she was for someone to acknowledge what she did, how invisible she'd become in her own life. Her phone had buzzed. Frank. "Working late, don't wait up." Eddie had seen her face change. "Everything okay?" "Fine," she'd lied. "Just tired." He'd looked at her for a long moment, and she'd had the unsettling feeling that he could see right through her. See all the ways she was breaking, all the cracks she was hiding, all the pain she refused to acknowledge. "You deserve better," he'd said quietly. Jean had gone home to an empty house that night. Frank's side of the bed was cold. His pillow still had the hospital corners she'd made that morning, untouched, unused. She'd pulled out her phone and looked at Eddie's message from earlier. The photo of him with the kids at the hospital, the caption asking if she was okay. For the first time, she'd let herself ask the question she'd been avoiding. Was she okay? And the answer, terrifying and freeing and utterly undeniable, was no. She hadn't been okay for a very long time, and somewhere in the shadows of her own life, while she'd been busy making everyone else's dreams come true, she'd lost herself completely. But that was about to change. Because John Barry had spent years being invisible, and tomorrow the world was going to finally see exactly who she was, what she was capable of, what they'd lost. Tomorrow, they would all learn what happened when you broke the heart of a queen. Chapter 3. The day the world shattered. Jean's suitcase sat open on the hotel bed, half-packed, while she stood at the window watching rain streak down the glass. The conference in Atlanta had been productive. Contracts signed, partnerships formed, another building added to her empire. But she hadn't been able to focus on any of it. Something was wrong. She'd felt it in her bones, a wrongness that pulled at her like a fishhook lodged in her chest. She'd made excuses to her business partners, cut the trip short, booked an earlier flight. They'd looked at her strangely. John Barry never left business unfinished, but she hadn't cared. She needed to go home. The taxi from the airport crawled through traffic, and Jean's hands wouldn't stop shaking. She'd called Frank twice. Both calls went to voicemail. She'd texted him. No response. Told herself she was being irrational, paranoid, ridiculous. Frank was probably just busy, at a meeting, in a presentation. There were 1,000 innocent explanations, but her gut knew. Her gut had known for months, maybe longer, and she'd ignored it because acknowledging the truth would mean facing what she'd become, a woman so desperate to be loved that she'd made herself disappear. Her house looked the same as always when the taxi pulled up. Beautiful, expensive, perfect. The lawn was manicured, the windows gleaming, the exterior exactly as it appeared in architecture magazines when they featured Frank's home. Not their home, his home. Because somehow, over the years, Jean had been edited out of her own life. She paid the driver, dragged her suitcase up the front steps, and pushed open the door. The first thing she noticed was Lily's toys, not in the guest house where Mona and her daughter lived, not in the backyard where they sometimes played, in the entryway, in the hallway, leading up the stairs like breadcrumbs in a nightmare fairy tale. Jean followed the trail with her heart hammering, a stuffed rabbit on the third stair, a plastic cup on the seventh, building blocks scattered on the landing, and at the end of the trail, her bedroom door stood open. Lily's portable crib was set up in the corner. The toddler bed Jean had bought for her last Christmas, thinking Lily might want to nap in the main house sometimes, was against the far wall. Mona's clothes hung in Jean's closet. Jean stood in the doorway of her own bedroom and felt reality tilt sideways. Voices drifted up from downstairs. She recognized them. Frank, Diane, Mona, all talking in her living room like they belonged there, like she was the intruder in her own home. She should have turned around, should have walked out, called Rita, handled this with lawyers and paperwork and cold precision. But something in her needed to see it, needed to look them in the eyes and understand how this had happened, how the woman who'd saved Mona from the streets, who'd loved Lily like her own, who'd built Frank's entire career from the shadows, had been erased so completely. Jean walked down the stairs, each step echoing in the sudden silence. They'd heard her, were waiting for her. She could feel it. The living room looked different. Photos of Jean had been removed from the mantel, replaced with pictures of Mona and Lily. A child's drawing was stuck to the refrigerator with magnets. Mona's jacket hung on the hook by the door where Jean's usually went. They'd redecorated. While Jean was working, building, providing, they'd been here erasing her. Diane Lawton sat in Jean's favorite chair, the wingback by the fireplace that had belonged to Jean's grandmother. She looked comfortable, entitled, like a queen on a throne. Frank stood by the window, shoulders tense, unable to meet Jean's eyes. And Mona sat on the couch with Lily on her lap, the little girl playing with a toy Jean had bought her last week. "Finally," Diane said, and her voice was sharp with satisfaction. "We've been waiting." Jean looked at each of them, her brain trying to process the scene, to make sense of what was happening. But there was no sense to be made. The evidence was everywhere. The truth was written in the guilty set of Frank's shoulders, the defiant tilt of Mona's chin, the triumphant gleam in Diane's eyes. "What is going on?" John's voice came out steady, cold, nothing like the screaming chaos inside her. Frank finally looked at her, and the guilt in his eyes told her everything before he even opened his mouth. "John, we need to talk." "Then talk." Silence. Frank's jaw worked like he was chewing words he couldn't quite spit out. Mona shifted on the couch, and John noticed for the first time that she was wearing John's necklace. The one Frank had given her for their 5th anniversary, the one that had belonged to his grandmother. "Give me my necklace back," John said quietly. Mona's hand went to her throat protectively. "Frank gave it to me." "Frank gave it to me first. It was a gift from my husband. Take it off." "She's not going to take it off," Diane said, and her voice had taken on that imperious tone Jean had endured for 8 years. "Because Mona is Frank's real partner now, the woman who understands him, who gives him what you never could." Jean's eyes stayed on Frank. "Tell your mother to shut her mouth, or I walk out that door right now and you never see me again." Frank's face went pale, but he didn't say anything. Didn't defend her. Didn't tell his mother to stop. Just stood there like a statue, letting Diane speak for him the way she always had. "You are not part of this family," Diane continued, standing up now, her face twisted with years of barely concealed contempt. "You never were. Even a beggar wouldn't marry you. You're cold, Jean. Barren. More businessman than woman. My son needs warmth. He needs a real home. He needs a real wife." The words should have hurt, should have cut. But Jean felt nothing, just a strange, floating numbness, like she was watching this happen to someone else. Diane turned to Mona, and her entire demeanor changed, softened, warmed. "Meet my son's real wife," she said, putting her hand on Mona's shoulder with a tenderness she'd never once shown Jean. "The woman who gave him what you never could, a family, a future." Lily reached for Jean from Mona's lap. "Auntie Jay," Mona pulled her back sharply. "No, baby, we don't talk to her anymore." That broke through the numbness. Jean looked at the child she'd held minutes after her birth, the little girl she'd rocked to sleep hundreds of times, who she'd loved with every piece of her shattered heart, and felt something inside her die. "How long?" John asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank finally found his voice. "John, it's not what you think." "How long?" 8 months, Mona said, and there was something almost proud in her voice, like she'd won a prize. "We tried to fight it, really we did, but we fell in love." 8 months. While John had been working herself to exhaustion to save Frank's firm, Mona had been in her bed. While John had been orchestrating Frank's success, Mona had been stealing her life. While John had been invisible, Mona had been preparing to replace her. "Get out," Frank said suddenly, and for a moment Jean thought he was talking to his mother and Mona, but then she saw where he was looking, at her, "This is my house, John. I think it's time you left." The laugh that came out of her was broken and sharp. "Your house? I've been paying the mortgage for 8 years. There is no mortgage, Frank. I bought this house outright before we got married. Your name has never been on the deed." The room went very quiet. Diane's face drained of color. Frank looked like she'd slapped him. "That's not... You said it was our house." "It is our house. Was our house. But legally, it's mine. Everything in it is mine. Even that necklace Mona's wearing belongs to me, since it was a gift and we're still married." Mona's hand went to the necklace again, this time to unclasp it, but Diane stopped her. "Don't you dare! That necklace belongs to this family, and you're part of this family now." Jean looked at them, really looked at them, and something in her chest hardened into diamond-sharp clarity. These people had taken everything from her: her trust, her kindness, her love, her identity. They'd hollowed her out and thrown away the pieces, thinking she was too weak or too desperate to fight back. They'd forgotten who they were dealing with. Jean smiled. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile of a woman who'd just remembered she was a queen, and queens did not beg for mercy from people who'd already declared war. "How much time do I have to pack?" she asked, her voice pleasant, conversational. The question seemed to throw them off. Diane had been expecting tears. Mona had been expecting begging. Frank had been expecting her to fight. "We can give you until tomorrow," Frank said, trying to sound magnanimous and failing. "That's very generous," Jean said. She looked around the living room one last time, at the home she'd created, the life she'd built, the family she'd thought was hers. "I'll be out by tonight." She turned and walked upstairs to pack, leaving them confused in her wake. She didn't take much, just her clothes, her grandmother's jewelry, her important documents. Everything else, every gift Frank had ever given her, every piece of furniture she'd bought, every decoration she'd chosen, she left behind, let them have it, let them think they'd won. On her way out, she stopped in the living room doorway one last time. Diane was already mentally redecorating. Mona was modeling the necklace in the mirror, and Frank was pouring himself a drink with shaking hands. "Enjoy the house," Jean said softly, "while it lasts." Frank turned. "What's that supposed to mean?" But Jean was already walking out the door, pulling out her phone, making a call. "Rita, it's time. Start everything." Behind her she heard Diane laugh, heard Mona ask Frank if they should order dinner to celebrate, heard Lily crying for her Auntie Jay while Mona shushed her. Jean got in her car, started the engine, and drove away from the only home she'd known for 8 years. She didn't cry, didn't look back, just drove in silence while her phone buzzed with confirmations from Rita, legal papers filed, eviction notices prepared, asset freezes initiated. The machine Jean had built over years of careful planning was now in motion, and nothing could stop it. Tomorrow morning at dawn, Frank Lawton and his new family would learn the first rule of war: never underestimate an invisible woman. Because the invisible ones see everything. They know everything. They've been planning for this moment since the first crack appeared in the foundation, and Jean Barry's revenge would be biblical. Chapter 4. 7 Days in Paradise. The first morning in Jean's house, Mona had woken up in the master bedroom and stretched like a cat in sunshine. The sheets were silk, expensive, the kind of fabric that whispered against skin. She'd looked over at Frank, still sleeping, and felt a surge of victory so intense it made her dizzy. She'd done it. After 3 years of playing the grateful charity case, the helpless single mother, the sweet girl who owed everything to Jean's kindness, she'd finally won. Diane had been right all along. Men like Frank didn't stay with women like Jean. Cold, career-focused women who spent more time in boardrooms than bedrooms. Women who couldn't even give a man children. Frank needed someone soft, warm, grateful. Someone who made him feel like a man instead of a project to manage. Mona had learned to be exactly that. She'd started small, like Diane had taught her, wearing makeup when Frank was around, laughing at his jokes, asking his advice on things she already knew the answer to, because men loved feeling needed, touching his arm when they talked, standing just a little too close, nothing Jean could call her out on, nothing Frank would recognize as seduction, just small things that planted seeds, and Diane had watered those seeds with poison. Jean doesn't appreciate him, Diane would say when she visited, always making sure to spend time alone with Mona. She's too busy with her empire to notice what a remarkable man my son is. He needs someone who sees him, really sees him. Mona had nodded along, playing the sympathetic listener, while Diane painted Jean as the villain in Frank's story. The wife who cared more about business than her husband. The woman who couldn't give him the family he deserved. The cold, calculating climber who'd probably only married Frank for social status anyway. None of it was true, and Mona had known it. She'd watched Jean work herself to exhaustion for Frank, seen her make phone calls at midnight to save his firm, witnessed her orchestrate his success while he took all the credit. Jean had been the invisible engine of Frank's entire life, and he'd never even noticed. But Mona had noticed, and she'd decided that if John was stupid enough to do all that work without demanding credit or appreciation, then she deserved to lose. Now, lying in John's bed, wearing John's necklace, raising her daughter in John's house, Mona felt nothing but satisfaction. She'd played the game and won, let John go cry in whatever apartment she'd moved to. This life belonged to Mona now. The first day, they'd celebrated. Diane had come over with champagne, toasting to new beginnings and the real Mrs. Lawton. Frank had been quieter than Mona expected, drinking more than usual, but she'd attributed it to guilt. He'd get over it. Men always did once the new relationship settled in. The second day, Mona had started redecorating. She'd thrown out Jean's photos, replacing them with pictures of her and Lily, rearranged the furniture, changed the sheets, erased every trace of Jean's presence like she'd never existed. Diane had helped, both of them laughing as they filled garbage bags with Jean's things, books Jean had collected, art Jean had chosen, little touches that had made this house a home. All of it went into storage or trash, because this was Mona's house now, and it needed to reflect Mona's taste. By the third day, Mona had invited friends over. Women from the mothers' group she'd joined. Women who'd always looked at her with pity when she'd lived in the guest house, treating her like the charity case she'd been. Now they looked at her with envy. "This is your house?" they'd asked, eyes wide as they took in the expensive furnishings, the gourmet kitchen, the sprawling backyard. "It's Frank's house," Mona had said modestly, but inside she'd been screaming with triumph. He worked very hard for it. She'd posted photos on social media, the house, the life, the family, hashtagged them with things like blessed and new beginnings and true happiness. Let Jean see them. Let her know exactly what she'd lost. Frank's business partner had called on the fourth day. "Congratulations on the new family situation," he'd said, and there was something knowing in his voice that made Mona preen. Everyone knew now. Everyone had seen the photos, heard the gossip. Frank Lawton had traded up, left his cold wife for someone better. On the fifth day, Diane had thrown a party. 30 people crammed into the living room, drinking expensive wine, eating catered food, celebrating the new family. Diane had introduced Mona to everyone as my daughter-in-law, giving her the title she'd never once given Jean, and Mona had basked in the attention. Lily had been confused by all the strangers, crying and asking for Auntie J, but Mona had shushed her. "Auntie J is gone, baby. This is our home now, just ours." One of the neighbors had filmed part of the party, posted it online. Frank Lawton's new family celebration. The video had gotten hundreds of views, Dozens of comments, most of them supportive, some calling Frank a midlife crisis cliché, a few calling Mona homewrecker. But Mona didn't care about those. She had everything she'd wanted: a beautiful home, a successful man, a ready-made family. By the sixth day, she'd fully settled in. This was her life now. She'd wake up in the master bedroom, make coffee in the gourmet kitchen, spend her days redecorating and shopping and living the life she'd always believed she deserved. Frank worked long hours, which was fine. It gave her time to enjoy the house, to revel in her victory. She'd even started planning the wedding, something big, expensive, the kind of event that would make everyone forget Jean had ever existed. Mona would become the official Mrs. Lawton, and Jean would be nothing but a footnote, the first wife, the practice round, the woman Frank had outgrown. The seventh morning, Mona woke up at dawn to pounding on the door. She'd rolled over, confused, checking the clock. Not even 6 yet. Who would be knocking this early? Frank had stumbled out of bed, pulling on a robe, and Mona had listened to him walk downstairs. Heard the front door open, then voices. Lots of voices. Professional, clipped, official sounding. Mona had gotten up, thrown on one of Jean's robes from the closet, and gone to the top of the stairs. What she'd seen had made her blood freeze. The entryway was full of people, lawyers in expensive suits, movers with clipboards, police officers with badges clearly visible, and at the front of this small army was a woman who looked like she could kill you with paperwork. "Mr. Frank Lawton," the woman was saying, "I'm Rita Cross, representing Ms. Jean Barry. This property is owned entirely by my client. You have 2 hours to vacate." Mona had rushed down the stairs. "What? No! This is Frank's house!" Rita had looked at her with the kind of cold assessment that made Mona feel like a bug under glass. "This property was purchased by Jean Barry before her marriage to Mr. Lawton. His name has never been on the deed. You are all trespassing, and you will leave." Frank had tried to argue, but Rita had simply handed him a stack of documents. Property deed, ownership papers, everything in Jean's name, everything proving that this house, this beautiful house Mona had spent a week claiming as her own, had never belonged to Frank at all. "You can't do this," Frank had said, his voice rising with panic. "We have rights. I've lived here for 8 years." "You've lived here as a guest of Jean Barry for 8 years, Rita had corrected. "That guest status has been revoked. You have 1 hour and 57 minutes. The movers hadn't waited for permission. They'd swarmed through the house like ants, professionally packing everything that belonged to Frank, Mona, and Lily. Mona had tried to grab things, to claim certain items as hers, but the movers had been relentless. "If it was purchased by Ms. Barry, it stays," they'd said. "If you brought it with you, you can take it." Everything Mona had brought with her fit in 3 suitcases. 3 suitcases versus an entire house full of furniture and art and expensive appliances. It had all belonged to Jean. Every single thing Mona had been celebrating, posting photos of, claiming as her own, had never been hers at all. Diane had arrived in the middle of the chaos, screaming about her son's rights, about lawyers, about injustice. Rita had handed her a document too, a restraining order. If Diane came within 100 feet of John or John's property, she'd be arrested. "This is illegal," Diane had shrieked. "This is justice," Rita had replied calmly. "Your son and his girlfriend have been living rent-free in property they don't own. Ms. Barry has been more than generous by giving you 2 hours instead of calling the police immediately. By the time the sun had fully risen, they'd been on the curb. Mona, Frank, Lily, and Diane, surrounded by suitcases and garbage bags, watching movers empty the last of their belongings onto the sidewalk. Neighbors had filmed everything. The videos had spread fast. Billionaire's ex-wife evicts cheating husband. Gold digger gets kicked out. Karma is real. The comments had been brutal, and Mona had deleted her social media accounts by noon. A car had pulled up, black. expensive. The window had rolled down just enough for Mona to see Jean sitting in the back seat, looking at them with an expression that wasn't quite anger. It was colder than that, more final. The window had rolled back up and the car had driven away. Mona had stood there on the curb, Lily crying in her arms, Diane screaming at Frank about lawyers, Frank looking shell-shocked and broken, and realized something terrible. This wasn't the end of Jean's revenge. This was just the beginning. Chapter 5. The Queen on her Throne. Frank had called 17 times before he'd accepted that Jean had blocked his number. Every call went straight to voicemail. Every text turned green and undelivered. It was like she'd erased him from her life with the same efficiency she'd used to erase him from her house. He'd spent that first night in a motel, the cheap kind with stained carpet and neighbors who screamed through the walls. Mona had cried. Diane had raged. Lily had asked for Auntie Jay until Mona had finally snapped at her to shut up, which had made the little girl cry harder. Frank had sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his phone, trying to understand how everything had fallen apart so quickly. 1 week ago, he'd been celebrating his new life. Now he was in a motel room that smelled like cigarettes and regret, with no idea what to do next. The next morning, he'd decided to go to John's office. She'd have to talk to him eventually. They were still married, technically. They needed to discuss things like adults, figure out the next steps. Maybe if he apologized, explained that he'd made a mistake, she'd at least talk to him. He'd arrived at the building and actually stopped in his tracks. It was massive. 40-some stories of glass and steel, and at the very top, in letters that caught the morning sun, were the words Barry Tower. How had he never noticed this before? He'd driven past this building 1,000 times, but he'd never connected it to John, never bothered to read the name, never asked her where she worked or what exactly her company did. He'd been so focused on his own career, his own struggles, his own life, that he'd never once thought to wonder about hers. The lobby was marble and chrome, full of people in expensive suits, moving with purpose. Frank had approached the security desk, suddenly aware that he was wearing yesterday's clothes and probably looked like hell. "I need to see John Barry," he'd said. The security guard had looked at him with the kind of polite indifference reserved for people who clearly didn't belong. "Do you have an appointment?" "I'm her husband." The guard had typed something into his computer, and his expression had shifted, hardened. "Ms. Barry has updated her emergency contacts and visitor permissions. You're not on the list, Mr. Lawton." The use of his name had been jarring. "How do you know who I am?" "We were given your photo this morning with instructions that you're not to be admitted to the building under any circumstances." Frank had felt his face heat. "I just need to talk to her for 5 minutes. Ms. Barry doesn't take unscheduled meetings. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." He'd tried to argue, but a second security guard had appeared, and Frank had recognized the threat for what it was. He'd left, humiliated, aware that people in the lobby were watching, judging, probably taking photos. That afternoon, his biggest client had called. "Frank, we're going to have to go with another firm for the waterfront project." Frank's stomach had dropped. The waterfront project was massive, a contract that would have sustained his firm for over a year. "What? We've been planning this for months. We had an agreement. We had a verbal understanding, not a contract. And frankly, with everything going on in your personal life, we think it's best to go in another direction." "My personal life has nothing to do with my work." But the client had already hung up. Another client had called an hour later. Same message. Then another. By evening, Frank's business partner had demanded an emergency meeting. They'd gone through the files together, and the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Every major contract Frank's firm had won in the past several years had come through anonymous recommendations or external consultants. The timing matched perfectly with moments when Frank had confided in Jean about financial trouble, the riverside development that had saved them from bankruptcy, recommended by an anonymous donor who turned out to be a woman who'd gone to college with John. The Morrison Hotel that had been their breakthrough project. The board member who'd pushed for Frank's firm was John's old roommate. The waterfront project they'd just lost. That had been facilitated by a foundation Jean sat on the board of. Every success, every victory, every moment Frank had felt like he'd finally made it on his own merit had been orchestrated by his wife, working in the shadows, pulling strings he'd never known existed. "How could you not know?" his business partner had asked, and there was accusation in his voice. Anger. "Your own wife was basically running our firm behind the scenes and you didn't notice." Frank hadn't had an answer, because the truth was worse than not noticing. The truth was that he'd been so convinced of his own talent, so assured that he deserved his success, that he'd never thought to question it, never thought to wonder why opportunities kept falling into his lap, never bothered to look behind the curtain. He'd taken it all for granted. Taken her for granted. That night, unable to sleep in the motel room, Frank had turned on the television and found Jean on the news. She was standing at a podium, announcing some new development project, and the mayor was kissing her hand like she was royalty. The governor was thanking her for her continued dedication to the city. Business leaders were calling her the heartbeat of our economy. This was his wife who he'd thought spent her days at an office job. His wife who he'd never bothered to ask about her work because he'd been too busy talking about his own. The camera had panned to show a man standing slightly behind Jean, tall, distinguished, kind face. The caption had read, "Dr. Eddie Flynn, founder of Flynn Free Clinics, funded by Barry Foundation." Jean had turned to say something to this Eddie, and Frank had seen her smile. A real smile, the kind she used to give Frank years ago, before life had worn them both down. Eddie had looked at her like she was the most important person in the world, and Jean had looked relaxed in a way Frank hadn't seen in years. His phone had rung, a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Lawton, this is First National Bank. We're calling about your business loan." Frank's heart had stopped. "What about it?" "The party who purchased and forgave your debt has rescinded that forgiveness. The full amount is now due, with interest. We'll need payment within 30 days, or we'll be forced to pursue legal action." The number they'd given him had made Frank's vision blur. It was more than his firm had in liquid assets, more than he could raise in a month, more than he could probably raise in a year. Jean had been paying his debts, not just facilitating his contracts, but actually paying money out of her own pocket to keep his firm afloat. And now she wanted it back. He'd hung up and immediately tried to call Jean again. Blocked. He'd called Rita Cross instead. "Ms. Cross, please, I need to talk to Jean. This is getting out of hand. The bank is exercising their legal right to collect a debt Mr. Lawton's firm owes," Rita had said calmly. "Jean purchased that debt years ago and forgave it as a gift to you. She's now exercising her legal right to collect it." "I don't have that kind of money." "Then perhaps you should have thought about that before moving your mistress into property you didn't own." Mistress. The word had hit Frank like a slap. That's what Mona was, not his girlfriend, not his new love, his mistress, the woman he'd cheated with while his wife was building his entire life. "Rita, please, I made a mistake. I know that now. I just need a chance to make this right." "You had 8 years to make it right, Mr. Lawton. You chose not to. Now you get to live with the consequences." She'd hung up. Frank had sat in that motel room, watching video after video of Jean on his phone, accepting awards, cutting ribbons on new buildings, visiting hospitals. In every video, she was confident, powerful, clearly respected, and even loved by the people around her. And in none of them did she mention him. It was like he didn't exist, like their 8-year marriage had been a blip in her life, forgettable and already forgotten. But the worst video had been from a children's hospital. Someone's amateur footage of Jean and Eddie reading to sick kids, both of them wearing matching volunteer badges. The date stamp was from over 3 years ago. 3 years. Jean had been volunteering with this man for 3 years, and Frank had never known. Never asked what she did with her free time. Never noticed when she came home late or left early. He'd been so wrapped up in his own world that he'd missed entire years of hers. In the video, a little boy had asked Jean, "Are you and Dr. Eddie married?" Jean had laughed, and the sound had been so genuinely happy it had made Frank's chest hurt. "No, sweetie, I'm married to someone else." "Does he come read to us too?" "No, he's very busy with his work." "That's sad," the kid had said. "You should marry Dr. Eddie instead. He's nicer." Eddie had looked embarrassed, but Jean had just smiled and changed the subject. Frank had watched that clip 5 times, each viewing more painful than the last. Because that kid had been right. Eddie was nicer. Or at least, he'd treated Jean better than Frank had. Noticed her. Appreciated her. Showed up for things that mattered to her. Frank had done none of that. And now he was in a motel room with a woman who'd only wanted him for his money and status, both of which were currently evaporating, while his actual wife was out there living a life so big and important he'd never even glimpsed it. His phone had buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "This is just the beginning. You took everything from me, Frank. Now I'm going to show you exactly what you lost." The message hadn't been signed, but Frank had known who it was from. Jean wasn't done with him, not even close. And for the first time in his life, Frank Lawton was genuinely afraid. Chapter 6. The House of Cards collapses. The apartment was too small for 4 people. 1 bedroom that Mona and Lily shared, a pull-out couch in the living room where Frank slept, and an air mattress on the floor that Diane refused to even acknowledge, choosing instead to sleep sitting up in the only chair, martyring herself loudly and constantly. "My son shouldn't be living like this," Diane said, for the 100th time, looking around the dingy space with visible disgust. "This is worse than poverty. This is humiliation." Frank didn't have the energy to argue. He'd spent the day fielding calls from creditors, watching his business implode, trying to figure out how to keep his firm alive when every client was abandoning ship and the bank was demanding immediate payment on debts he couldn't even begin to cover. Mona was on the phone in the bedroom, and from the shrill tone of her voice, it wasn't going well. Lily sat on the floor playing with the few toys they'd been able to bring, singing quietly to herself, oblivious to the catastrophe unfolding around her. Frank's business partner had called that morning. "We're voting you out, Frank. The board met last night and it was unanimous. You're destroying this firm's reputation and we can't afford to keep you on. You're kicking me out of the company I built?" "The company Jean built," his partner had corrected coldly. "We went through everything. Every contract, every deal, every successful pitch. They all trace back to her. You were just the face, Frank, the name on the door. But she was the foundation, and now that she's gone, there's nothing holding this up." The firm Frank had spent 10 years building was being taken from him. His name would be stripped from the door. His office cleared out. His reputation destroyed. All because he'd been stupid enough to think he'd done it alone. Mona emerged from the bedroom, her face flushed with anger. "That was my friend Bethany. She said she can't help us. Can you believe that? After everything I've done for her, she won't even lend us money to get back on our feet." Frank looked at her, really looked at her, and wondered what he'd ever seen in this woman. She was pretty, sure, young, soft in all the ways Jean was hard. But there was something brittle about her now that the fairy tale had shattered, something mean. "Maybe she doesn't have money to lend," Frank said tiredly. "Everyone has money to lend. She just doesn't want to help us because Jean probably got to her first. Jean's been poisoning everyone against us." "Jean doesn't have to poison anyone," Frank said, and the bitterness in his own voice surprised him. We did a pretty good job of that ourselves. Mona's eyes narrowed. Don't you dare take her side. I'm not taking anyone's side. I'm just stating facts. Facts? The fact is Jan had no right to throw us out. The fact is she's vindictive and cruel. The fact is she's trying to destroy us because she can't handle that you chose me over her. The laugh that came out of Frank was ugly. I didn't choose you, Mona. I just stopped appreciating what I had and let you take advantage of that. Take advantage? You pursued me. You pursued me. Don't rewrite history. You were in my kitchen every day, touching my arm, laughing at my jokes, wearing perfume and makeup, and doing everything short of throwing yourself at me. Diane stood up, her face twisted with rage. Don't you talk to her that way. Mona loves you. She gave you what that cold witch never could. Mona gave me exactly what I deserved, Frank shot back. A shallow relationship based on mutual delusion. Mona's face went red, then white. How dare you? How dare I? How dare you? Frank was on his feet now, months of suppressed guilt and anger finally boiling over. You lived in Jean's guest house. She saved you from the streets. She was in the delivery room when Lily was born. She loved your daughter like her own, and you repaid that kindness by sleeping with her husband and stealing her life. She had too much anyway, Mona screamed. Why should she get everything? The house, the money, the perfect life, when she didn't even appreciate it, when she was too busy working to even notice her own husband? I gave you attention. I made you feel special. You made me feel stupid, Frank roared. You and my mother made me feel like I deserved more than what I had, like Jean was the problem instead of my own selfishness. Diane slapped him. The sound cracked through the tiny apartment like a gunshot. Don't you blame me for your mistakes, she hissed. I introduced you to a woman who actually wanted to be a wife, who understood family values, who gave you a child. Lily isn't mine, Frank shouted. She's Mona's. I'm not her father. I've known her for barely 3 years, and for most of that time she was Jean's child more than mine. Stop rewriting reality to make yourself feel better about destroying my marriage. The words hung in the air. Lily had stopped playing, looking up at the adults with wide, frightened eyes. Diane's face went cold. I came to you 2 years ago, she said to Mona, ignoring Frank entirely, and told you my son was unhappy in his marriage. I told you that if you made yourself available, he would see what real warmth looked like. I promised you a good life, a mansion, financial security, a real family, and you've delivered on your end. So where is what I promised? Mona stared at her. You came to me 2 years ago? Of course I did. You think this just happened? You think my son just accidentally fell in love with you? Diane's laugh was cruel. I planted every seed, every conversation about how cold Jean was, every comment about how Frank needed someone warmer, every time I brought you around and made sure you two were alone together. I orchestrated this whole thing. Frank felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. You what? Diane turned to him, her face triumphant, despite the squalor they were living in. Your marriage to Jan was always doomed. She was never good enough for you. Too ambitious, too focused on her career, too barren to give you children. I needed to help you see that, so I found someone better, someone grateful, someone who knew her place. Mona's hands were shaking. You used me? I used both of you, Diane said impatiently, and it should have worked. You should be in that mansion right now, planning your wedding, living the life I promised. But Jean turned out to be more vindictive than I expected. She's fighting back. Fine, we'll fight harder. There is no we, Frank said quietly. His voice was dead, empty. Get out. Excuse me? Get out of my apartment, out of my life. I never want to see you again. Diane's face went purple. I am your mother. I did this for you. You did this for yourself. Frank's voice rose again. You never liked Jean because she didn't bow down to you, because she had her own money and her own career and didn't need your approval. You couldn't control her, so you decided to destroy her, and I was stupid enough to let you. Frank, you're being ridiculous. Get out! Diane grabbed her purse, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. "Fine. Live in your poverty with your whore and her bastard child. See if I care, but don't come crying to me when you realize what you've lost." She slammed out of the apartment, and the silence she left behind was suffocating. Mona was crying now, ugly sobs that shook her whole body. "This isn't what I wanted. This was supposed to be different. She promised me you had money, that we'd have a good life together." "I don't have money," Frank said flatly. "I never had money. Jean had money. Jean had everything, and we threw it away." But you're an architect. You have a firm." "Had a firm. They voted me out this morning. And even when I had it, the firm was running on Jean's connections and Jean's money. My name was on the door, but she built the whole thing." Mona looked at him with dawning horror. "So what do we have?" "Nothing. Debt. Each other. That's it." She stood there, holding Lily, looking around the apartment, and Frank could see the exact moment she realized she'd bet everything on the wrong horse. "I loved you," she said, but it sounded like a question. "No, you didn't," Frank said tiredly. "You loved what you thought I could give you, what my mother promised I could give you, but none of it was ever real." Mona's face hardened. "Then I guess we're both idiots." She took Lily into the bedroom and closed the door. Frank heard her on the phone again, and from the sweet tone she was using, she was already looking for her next opportunity, her next man with money, her next ticket out of poverty. Frank sat down on the pull-out couch and pulled out his phone, scrolled through photos of Jean, their wedding day, vacations they'd taken, quiet evenings at home. In every photo she was smiling, but now that Frank was really looking, he could see something in her eyes. A distance, a sadness. Like even in their happiest moments, she'd been alone. He'd done that to her, made her invisible in her own marriage, taken her love and support and sacrifices and treated them like they were his due, like he deserved a wife who built his career in secret and asked for nothing in return. His phone buzzed. A video someone had sent him, probably thinking they were being helpful. John at a restaurant with Eddie Flynn. They were laughing about something, and Eddie was looking at her the way Frank should have been looking at her for 8 years, like she was fascinating, important, worth his full attention. The video was dated from yesterday. Jean had moved on already. Or maybe she'd started moving on months ago, when Frank had been too busy with Mona to notice his wife slipping away. Frank watched the video until the screen went dark, then sat in the darkness of the apartment, listening to Mona on the phone, trying to seduce her way into another man's wallet, and realized something terrible. He'd destroyed the best thing that ever happened to him, and there was no going back. The house of cards he'd built his life on was collapsing, and he had no one to blame but himself. Chapter 7. The Invisible Heroine. Frank couldn't sleep. The pull-out couch was lumpy and cheap, but that wasn't what kept him awake. It was the questions, the endless tormenting questions about what he'd missed, how much he'd missed, how blind he'd been. At 3 in the morning, he'd given up on sleep and started going through old emails on his phone, messages from clients, business partners, contractors, and there, buried in forwarded emails and CC'd messages, were hints of the truth he'd never bothered to look for. Following up on our conversation with Jay Barry regarding the Morrison project. As per the recommendation from Barry Foundation, Jay Barry suggested we reach out to your firm specifically. Jean's name, Jean's influence, woven through every success Frank had claimed as his own. She'd been there all along, invisible but essential, and he'd never once thought to question why opportunities kept falling into his lap. By dawn, Frank had made a decision. He needed to know the full truth, needed to understand exactly what Jean had done, what he'd destroyed. So he'd called a private investigator, one of the few professional contacts who hadn't cut him off yet. "I need you to pull everything on my wife, Jean Barry. Every business dealing, every financial transaction involving me or my firm. I need to know what I didn't see." The investigator had been quiet for a moment. "Frank, are you sure you want to know?" "I'm sure." It had taken the investigator 3 days to compile the report. 3 days of Frank existing in the dingy apartment, watching Mona become more bitter and distant, listening to Lily ask for Auntie Jay until Mona would snap at her to stop. 3 days of creditors calling, former clients avoiding him, his entire professional life crumbling while he waited for confirmation of what he already knew. When the investigator finally called him to his office, Frank had walked in expecting facts and figures. What he'd gotten was devastation. "I'm going to be honest with you," the investigator had said, spreading files across his desk. "In 20 years of doing this job, I have never seen someone love another person this much." He'd started with the basics. The house Frank had thought was his. Jean had bought it outright before their marriage. His name had never been on the deed. She could have kicked him out at any point, but she'd let him believe it was theirs. The firm's debt that Frank thought had been forgiven by the bank? Jean had purchased it through a shell company, then quietly absorbed the payments herself. Hundreds of thousands of dollars she'd paid out of her own pocket, never asking for acknowledgement or repayment. But it went deeper than that. "This is the Morrison Hotel contract," the investigator had said, pulling out a file. "Your firm won this through what you believed was an exceptional presentation, correct?" Frank had nodded. June called in a favor with her college roommate who sat on the board. But before she made that call, she spent 3 weeks researching every aspect of the project, then anonymously sending your firm detailed market analysis and design suggestions. You thought your team came up with those ideas organically. File after file, contract after contract. Every single success had Jean's fingerprints on it. The Riverside development that had saved Frank's firm from bankruptcy. Jean had convinced the developer to take a chance on a smaller firm by personally guaranteeing any cost overruns. The waterfront project that had been Frank's dream job. Jean had joined the foundation board specifically to be in a position to recommend his firm. The architectural guild that had given Frank his prestigious membership. Jean had known the president for years and had written a recommendation letter under a colleague's name because she'd known Frank's pride wouldn't allow him to accept help. She was working 18-hour days, the investigator had said quietly, running her own empire while simultaneously building yours, and she did it in a way that made sure you'd never know, made sure you'd feel like you'd earned everything yourself. Then the investigator had pulled out security footage. "This is from Jean's office building. I got access through a contact." The screen had shown Jean at her desk at 2 in the morning, still in her work clothes, making phone calls. The timestamp was from 3 years ago. The investigator had fast-forwarded through similar footage. Jean working late into the night, night after night, week after week. She'd work a regular job all day, then spend her evenings managing your career. Then she'd go home and you'd tell her about your successes, and she'd celebrate with you like she had nothing to do with them. Frank had watched footage of Jean from 2 years ago, after Diane's birthday party. She'd been crying in her office, makeup ruined, and then she'd wiped her face, fixed herself up, and made a phone call that turned out to be her securing Frank's next big contract. She'd been humiliated by his mother and had responded by making sure Frank's firm survived another quarter. "This one's rough," the investigator had warned, pulling up another video. "This is from about a year ago." The footage showed June in what looked like a hospital waiting room. She was alone, holding paperwork, and she'd been crying. The investigator had pulled up medical records he'd somehow obtained. She had a health scare, possible cancer. She went through tests alone because you were... He'd checked his notes. At a business retreat your firm was doing, a retreat she'd paid for. Frank had felt like he was going to be sick. Did she have cancer? No, but she didn't know that for a week, and she went through that week alone, still making sure your project stayed on track, still managing your career in the background. The final file had been the worst. She kept journals, the investigator had said. I got access to some entries through her personal assistant who was worried about her. I think you should read this one. It's from 8 months ago. He'd handed Frank a printed page. Jean's handwriting, neat and precise, even in a personal journal. Frank was upset today because the Henderson project fell through. He came home devastated, and I held him while he talked about feeling like a failure. What I didn't tell him is that I spent last night convincing 3 of my contacts to consider proposals from his firm for even bigger projects. By next month, he'll have opportunities he never dreamed of, and he'll think it's because the Henderson falling through freed up his schedule for better things. He'll never know I orchestrated it. He'll think it's luck or fate or his own talent, and that's how it should be. Frank needs to believe in himself. My job is to make sure he has reasons to. Even if it means I stay invisible. Even if it means he never sees me. His confidence matters more than my acknowledgement. His happiness matters more than mine. I love him enough to disappear. Frank had stopped reading, put the paper down with shaking hands, looked at the investigator with tears in his eyes. Keep reading, the investigator had said gently. There's more. Frank had picked it back up. I saw Mona looking at Frank today in that way women look at men they want. I should confront it, should protect my marriage. But I'm so tired of fighting for a man who doesn't see me anymore. Maybe I'll just let it happen. Maybe Frank deserves someone who makes him happy in ways I no longer can. Maybe the kindest thing I can do is let him go, even if it destroys me. Even if Mona takes everything I built and claims it as hers. Even if I end up alone. Frank's happiness matters more than mine. It always has. The investigator had given him space to sit with that, to understand the full magnitude of what Jean had done, what she'd been willing to sacrifice. There's one more thing, the investigator had said finally. Eddie Flynn. Frank had looked up, steel himself for confirmation of an affair. They're friends. That's it. I looked into everything, and there's no romantic relationship, but Flynn knows what Jean does. He sees her, actually sees her, and she's been volunteering with him for over 3 years, going to children's hospitals, reading to sick kids, funding his clinics, not for publicity or tax breaks, but because it matters to her. The investigator had pulled up a final video. Jean and Eddie at a hospital, surrounded by children. One little girl had asked Jean, "Why don't you bring your husband?" Jean had smiled sadly. "He's very busy with important work." "Is your work not important?" the girl had asked. "Not to everyone," Jean had replied. "But it's important to me, and that's enough." Eddie had looked at Jean with such gentle understanding, and Jean had looked back with gratitude for being seen. Not desired, not pursued, just seen. Frank had left the investigator's office with the files and drove to nowhere in particular, ended up parked outside Jean's office building, watching people come and go. Important people, powerful people, all of them smaller than his wife, who he'd treated like she was barely worth his attention. He'd pulled out his phone and searched Jean's name, found articles he'd never read,